Hello and welcome to another week of Religion in America, Remote Learning Edition. This week we're talking about mid-century realignments, meaning here the mid-20th century and changes in religion. And what we're going to do in these sessions is first look at HERBERG's text and do a little sorting about what it is that he's saying in that text. And then I'm going to step back and think more broadly about what was going on in particularly the 1940s and 1950s that changed religion in America in some very profound ways. So here's where we're headed. Historically, in the late 1940s and 1950s, being religious, meaning identifying as Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, became a way of asserting Americanness, at least for white Americans. For others, racial and cultural divisions remained, as they long had been, largely determinative of acceptance in the United States. And then theologically, and this is really what we're looking at with HERBERG, what are the critiques of the American way of life, or what kind of critiques should religion offer, and can it? So in terms of our larger overarching question for this course about religious diversity in America, what we're going to be talking about now is a moment where it becomes acceptable in the United States to be Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, broadly speaking. Still, there were pockets of very anti-Catholic sentiment or anti-Jewish sentiment, but in a way that hadn't been true, say, in the 19th century, being Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish all become ways of asserting Americanness that other people read as acceptable. So I want to talk a little bit about a contrast here. This first picture is from the 1920s, and what that is, it's maybe a little hard to see, but what that is, it's a march of the Ku Klux Klan down main streets of Washington, D.C. In the late 19th century, after the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan had arisen in the South as a way of trying to reassert white power in the South. And then it had died away, and then it re-rose again in a really powerful way in the late 19 teens, particularly the 1920s. There were Klan associations all over the United States, North and South. And the Klan was still opposed to any kind of African American political power, but also really took on immigration, Jewish immigration and Catholic immigration. So the Klan was here asserting, again, something we've seen before, Anglo-Protestant identity to the United States. Contrast that what happens in the 1940s, particularly amid World War II. The experience of World War II was a turning point in the ways that, again, white Americans thought about religious diversity when we mean the religious diversity of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. This stamp is the Immortal Chaplain stamp, and it comes from a story that happened in World War II where there was a boat that was sunk, a military boat, and the four chaplains, who were Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, gave up their life vests and hooked arms and went down singing and praying together. And it was a story that was told about how these religious people had united for the greater good. Okay? So, and it didn't matter that one was Protestant, one was Catholic, and one was Jewish. They were all seen as being good Americans. So again, this is a turning point, particularly for Jews and Catholics who had long been sort of maybe okay Americans. Now there's this sense that being Catholic, being Jewish is a fine way to be American. Now, again, this didn't include everybody. This World War II is also the era of Japanese internment, which means that they were putting Japanese people, citizens, not citizens, into internment camps. Many of those people were Buddhist, and their Buddhism was not seen as a viable way to be religious in America. The dog tags that people wore in World War II identified your religion, and you could be Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. There was no way for, say, Buddhist soldiers, and there were Buddhist soldiers, to identify officially that they were Buddhist. So now I want to turn to the HERBERG text and think a little bit about his argument in this text, a famous sociological text called Protestant-Catholic-JEW. And what this text argues is basically what I just said, that by the mid-1950s, being Protestant, being Catholic, or being Jewish had all become fine ways to be American, that you could be a good American and be any of those. So I'm going to just walk through a few of the pieces of HERBERG's test, particularly his critique of what he sees as mid-1950s American religiosity. So let's just start with his key point. No one who attempts to see the contemporary religious situation in the United States in perspective can fail to be struck by the extraordinary pervasiveness of religious identification among present-day Americans. What he's saying here is simply a historical fact. People affiliated with religion in huge numbers in the 1950s. I think oftentimes we think of, say, the colonial period or the 19th century being this high point of religious affiliation. It's actually the 1950s. People went back to religious communities in droves following World War II. So in terms of adherence, it's an incredibly religious time in the United States. So then HERBERG says that what is really happening isn't so much that people are identifying with the dogmatic positions of the different religions or getting really on board with different ways of seeing the world theologically, but that what is happening is that these religions are underwriting something that HERBERG calls the American way of life. And let's look what he says. It seems to me that a realistic appraisal of the values, ideas, and behaviors of the American people leads to the conclusion that Americans, by and large, do have their common religion, and that religion is the system familiarly known as the American way of life. So in other words, underneath your identification as Protestant or Catholic or Jewish, there was this more kind of fundamental religion that HERBERG calls the American way of life, and that you could show that you were part of the American way of life by being a Protestant, by being Catholic, or being Jewish, but that was really sort of the substructure. Now again, he's clear that this is about white people. African American Protestants, most African Americans were Protestants, aren't able to get in sort of under the sacred canopy that he's describing. So then HERBERG says there are some characteristics of the American way of life. It supports democracy, right? The American idea of democracy. Free enterprise, so it has an economic sense that the best economic system is a free market system. He says the American way of life is individualistic, right? The focus on the individual, the social mobility of the individual, the rights of the individual. He says it's optimistic, right? The American kind of can-do attitude, the sense of progress, the sense of things getting better. It's dynamic. It's pragmatic, so it's a kind of a question of what works. That sort of tells you what's good. And he says it's idealistic, and he said this is a really important characteristic, that Americans are, at least understand themselves to be driven by ideals and driven by a sense of what is their sense of good. And this is kind of an interesting thing, right, that they're pragmatic and idealistic both, but he says those two actually do hold together in this, that there's this kind of can-do attitude, but also a sense of we live by these grand ideals. So who's not part of this? Well, again, people who aren't white. And then he points to some groups that include white people that aren't part of the American way of life, who are religious, but whose churches haven't bought in. And he notes a few. Immigrant ethnic churches. So these could be Reformed, out of the Reformed tradition, out of the Lutheran tradition, out of the Catholic tradition, but they're communities that have kept their sense of an ethnic identity that also is instantiated in a religious identity. So let me make that a bit more sense, and we'll talk here about Lutherans, that there are Lutherans who, even up into the Second World War, had kept their native European language, often German, as their theological language, precisely because they wanted to be careful about translating their theology into English, fearing that it would water it down. So there are these ethnic immigrant churches that have really maintained a strong sense of being from someplace in Europe, and they see that strong ethnic identity as protecting their religious tradition from Americanization. Something called neo-orthodoxy. We'll talk more about this in the next section, but basically neo-orthodox theologians were theologians more on the theological left, or maybe the theological center, but they weren't liberals. So let me explain what that means. These were theologians who accepted things like historical criticism. We talked about that last time, remember? So there are people who are going to say, yeah, there are two different creation accounts in the Bible, and you can't read everything that the Bible says as historically accurate. But they were also theologians who took the doctrine of sin very, very seriously, and actually thought that the liberal theologians of the recent past had really failed to appreciate how much sin how pervasive sin was in the world. They felt that people were actually much too optimistic about human progress and what human beings could do. So he says the neo-Orthodox aren't part of this American way of life. They tend to be critics of its optimism and its sense of individual autonomy. And then what he called the religions of the disinherited. These are groups like the holiness traditions and Pentecostal traditions. You read about some of these in Kester, but these are traditions that have a very heightened sense of the presence of God in everyday life and the miraculous in everyday life. These are traditions that I think more recent historians would actually protest the idea that these are religions of the disinherited. But in HERBERG's time, they were seen as religions that people from a lower socioeconomic strata were drawn to because they had ready access to divine power, the expectation that God would break in miraculously. And I think he puts them outside of the American way of life, in part because they do have this strong sense of the supernatural that can upend the status quo, and religions of the American way of life like the status quo. That's what they're affirming. All right, so what is HERBERG's evaluation of the American way of life? Well, he has many things to say. Some of them just sort of analysis, some of them critique. So the first thing he says is that what's happened in America in the 1940s and 1950s is that religions have become more like each other. He says, under the influence of the American environment, the historic Jewish and Christian faiths have tended to become secularized in the sense of becoming integrated as parts within a larger whole defined by the American way of life. So in other words, people are still defining as Jewish or still defining as Catholic, but a lot of their particularities have been watered down, or people have stressed them less so that they can really accentuate their fit with this American way of life. So what he's saying that it's not so much that Protestants, Catholic, and Jews have been accepted on their own terms, that people are just so tolerant that we're like, yes, it's okay to be Jewish in any way you want to be Jewish, and it's okay to be Catholic in any way you want to be Catholic. What HERBERG is saying has actually happened is that Protestant Jews and Catholics have watered down their particularity enough so that they're all acceptable, kind of in the way that beige is always acceptable. I actually really like beige a lot and think it's beautiful. But right, I mean, it's beige, and so how could you not accept it? He's saying that that's really what's happened. Then he says that really why people are prizing religion in the 1940s and 1950s is precisely because it's seen as underwriting the American way of life. So, in this reversal, the Christian and Jewish faiths tend to be prized because they help promote ideals and standards that all Americans are expected to share on a deeper level than merely official religion. So, again, the price for acceptance has been that you are excited about America and excited about individualism and excited about free enterprise and excited about democracy. So you can be any of the three religions, Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, but because those are all now seen as underwriting what Herberg said is more fundamental to a lot of people, the American way of life. Now Herberg's going to get into things he really doesn't like about the American way of life and the way religion interacts with it. He says that there's a problem here for religions of idolatry. Religion becomes, in effect, the cult of culture and society, in which the right social order and the received cultural values are divinized by being identified with divine purpose. So, in other words, the nation really becomes God, and attributes of the nation become God. And what people are worshiping is not, say, the God of the Bible, but the God of being American, the God of free enterprise. And Herberg says that traditionally for Jews and Christians is idolatry, worshiping something that isn't God. But religion and the American way of life have become so enmeshed that people don't recognize this as idolatry. National self-righteousness. In a more directly political sense, Herberg said, this religiosity very easily comes to serve as a spiritual reinforcement of a national self-righteousness and a spiritual authentication of national will. Remember, when Herberg says that Americans are idealistic, he's not necessarily saying that as a compliment. He's saying that Americans think of themselves as these people of ideals, but that can actually blind us to our own foibles, right? If everything we do is good and right and all of our kind of national ideals are good and right, it becomes very hard to self-critique. And he says, when you identify your nation with the good and with God, what are you going to say that's bad about it? You might remember in Herberg's piece, he talks about one of the ways that you know that what people really have for their religion is the American way of life is that Protestants, Catholics, and Jews all traditionally teach that you're supposed to love your enemies. But in the 1940s and 1950s, Americans who are going to church and to synagogue would say, according to Herberg, that they hate communists. And Herberg says, like, look, if you're hating communists, your religion is the religion of the nation that's opposed to communism. It's not the religion of Jews and Catholics and Protestants that would say that you might disagree with communism, but you have to love communists. That just tells you that your religion has become about affirming whatever your nation does. Then Herberg notes that this religion of the American way of life is very human-centered. As one surveys the contemporary scene, it appears that the results Americans want to get out of faith are primarily peace of mind, happiness, and success in worldly achievement. Religion is valued too as a means of cultural enrichment. So in other words, for Herberg, the point of religion in the 1940s and 1950s for many Americans isn't the worship of the transcendent God. It's not to try and align one's life to this overarching view of reality. It's not the kind of obedience to this vision of the good that, say, we saw in Heschel. Remember Heschel, who wanted Jews to observe all the law, so they would orient all of their lives to God and attune all of their lives to God. Herberg says that's not what's happening in a lot of these religious services or in these religious, is that Americans are using religions in some ways as therapy. This is self-help. This is self-improvement. And Herberg may not have been opposed to those, because that's not the role of religion. Traditionally, he says, Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism have all offered really incisive critiques of power and of nations and of our own ideas about what is right and what is wrong. And now religion has really become about affirming us and just telling us that we are supposed to be happy, that success is a sign that we have been favored by God. And he says, traditionally, none of those faiths said that. And so now you know that religion has become much more human-centered rather than God-centered. So overall, what HERBERG sees in the 1950s is this. Lots of adherence to religion. Lots of adherence to religion in the United States. More acceptance of what, at least on the face of it, looks like religious diversity. Protestants, Catholics, and Jews are all accepted as good Americans. But at least according to HERBERG, what you really have here is the acceptance of the American way of life as the national religion that then can be instantiated by Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, can be lived out by Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, but at the price of foregoing the kinds of theological commitments, the kind of robust theology that might critique either the nation or ourselves. So in the next section, I'm going to back up from this a little bit and talk a little bit more about the larger landscape that HERBERG was critiquing.